So section number 6 is about ethics. The ethics of AI use in planning, education, and practice. So we have 4 presentations, and we'll start with Dr. Moira Zeller. All right.
Yes.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Well, make sure you signed in. You have your email. We'll also reach out to you. People sign in or put your email. Feel free to email me because what we're going to do is we're going to check with all the authors of the presentation, make sure it's okay to distribute and get their copyright. And if those are paid, we'll just send you the whole packet or come to the website where it is, and you can download. So if you miss something or a presenter didn't get to it, rest assured, hopefully you'll have access.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's been a long and but very intense and wonderful day. Typically, what I do when I teach at night is I make my students do jumping jacks. At this time, I think they would be good, but like I did. Thank you, Tom. But like if you need to stand and shake or dance or whatever, you know, please go ahead because it's great to be here, but it's been a long sitting day. I did want to first of all acknowledge that I am not the first author of this work. Theo Lim and Christy and Sarah have been working on this before me, and I joined later. Very much grateful for that opportunity, but they've been leading the way. And Sarah, I think also her name may not have been included in the program, but she's definitely one of the contributors. And I think Theo and Sarah are here on Zoom. So what we wanted to do was expand the conversation on the ethics of AI. And the idea here is that there are ethical issues that are related to generative AI that generally focus on the problems with tech, but do not necessarily capture broader kinds of impacts that we care about in planning. And so we want to broaden that conversation and explore how AI can, what role it can have in a planning context, and how it may alter learning and communication, how it may exclude perspectives and epistemologies. It can bypass productive friction and alter public expectations of planning on government. And so what we're asking is how do we weigh appropriate roles for generative AI in a planning context that are supportive of deliberative democracies, assuming that that's what we want. That's the big if. Okay, so some of the typical agency guidelines and principle focus mostly on then this idea of more immediate issues that we've talked about earlier today, like bias, environmental impacts, privacy, security, transparency, and human oversight. And recognizing that trust is definitely easier to lose than to build. So can we expand on these considerations to include other possible problems of substituting planning tasks, not planning necessarily, or not planners, but planning tasks with AI? And so Theo actually put this wonderful figure together, looking at other kinds of ethics or frameworks of ethics within planning that we abide by. And we see that the ones that, that the agencies tend to focus on cover some of the deontological, so that are focused on process, and teleological that are focusing on outcomes. But there's like another one, which is like this relational virtue ethics, and there's things in between that are combination perhaps of the three. And so there's not much of this, like in the discussion about the problems with tech. There's not much of what it means to be human as an individual and within a collective. And there are other ethical values within this triangle, and AI can be disruptive of all of these, and yet it is not capable of being dialogic, and it statistically sounds like a human, but it's not, and it doesn't engage or allows us to engage, kind of like the comment that I had earlier in one of the presentations, and also has fueled misinformation. And that can interfere with some of the more like deontological and teleological, so both process and outcomes of some of our planning processes. So the danger of focusing on the problems with tech assumes perhaps that if we can mitigate those problems, then we'll be fine. But when we look at, other frameworks, we may be asking questions like, under what circumstances should direct human interaction be prioritized if AI were used to avoid conflict? What is the goal of community engagement if AI might, quote unquote, better articulate community concerns? What are the consequences of not acting in community where we risk making mistakes and train in AI-enabled environments? How can we build trust through AI-simulated interactions? How do we safeguard and build upon different ways of knowing that are not language-based or image-based, right? So these are not hypothetical cases. In fact, there were some that were presented early in when we were talking around Justin's presentation in the morning, and then Renee's as well, where you could have a planner, and I think Alexander, I don't know if he's still here, but like we were talking about that, like a planner that is not in a well-resourced community, and so they're pressed to create a community engagement situation, so they get like all of this listening session and try to synthesize all of these different opinions and perspectives and needs and priorities. But then, with AI, there could be like a much better synthesis, if you will, or a wider synthesis, and maybe do it better and faster. But then, like, again, this raises some of the questions of, what do we miss? What do we leave out if we do that? Like where we maybe even bypass the community engagement altogether because we can do it better with AI. So there's this notion of self-reinforcement and a certain boosterism that is similar to economics way, in the past, or maybe still in the present, where we prioritize efficiencies and what is quantifiable, what is rational, predictable over other priorities that are about the messier planning world and just, I would say, just life in general. And so there's this other aspect to consider as well, to expand on, which we kind of like touched upon but very little here, I think, as yet, is this, there are studies showing the broader concern of atrophy. Like if we don't use our minds, our individual thinking, our collective, ability to relate to each other, we lose those skills, we lose those capabilities. And so again, it's not just cognitive, but relational. I mean, I know that I cannot use the AI note taker thing because I cannot remember anything. I have to take my own notes, right? The AI thing doesn't just work for me. And in a way, it's about also making this learning and this process too easy, if you will, and even unnecessary. And that's a part where making things hard, I had also read a recent article on this, that making things hard actually helps us learn and helps us be more thoughtful. So to me, the question is, does this help us think? Does it help us relate in order for us to deliberate more effectively? And so that's, sorry, that was part of the same thing. And then finally, sorry, I went too fast there, but the one thing that we wanted to also expand on is this idea of efficiency again, and where we see this blue line of like the goal or the vision from, especially from the corporate world, is that there's going to be this stepwise thing. It's like super efficient, and we're going to be like, at that great level of efficiency up there. But the problem is that there are mistakes in AI. Deloitte actually made a really good one recently. And so there's the problem is that when we don't know what is in it, especially in a context where we have machines coding them, doing their own code, right? And we don't know what is in there, they're black boxes. And so mistakes are much, much harder to find. They set us back much more. That's the purple line. And in the end, we don't do as well. Plus, there's all of this aspect of inappropriate, framing and inexperience in critically understanding and assessing the outputs, versus the orange line, which is kind of like the human process that may be slower, but it, in our vision, it can get us farther and faster in the end if we consider that the purple line would be what we're perhaps doing now. So there are trade-offs also with other things that planners care about, not just efficiency, but like, other values as well. And then finally, like where I what we wanted to consider and expand on is that this notion of inevitability of AI, right? AI is here, might as well embrace it, right? This, however, raises the question of like, well, whether there are other things that are here, they have been here for a long time, and it doesn't mean that we want to embrace them. For example, corruption. For example, extremism. They're pervasive. Should we embrace them too? I don't know about you, I wouldn't, but you know, everybody has their values. But what we're trying to propose here is that there is value to human thought, but also to human processes and relationships. And so that's what, you know, like, again, like what we're trying to do here is simply expand the conversation beyond like the problems with tech to consider these other aspects, dimensions, and values. So I might have gone way too fast, sorry about that, but I did want to make sure that I was within the 10 minutes. Again, I do want to acknowledge my co-authors here. Also mention that some of them are in the ACSP AI task force. And again, what we do is welcome the conversation. So that's what we're hoping to do now. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Let's save 2 minutes. So let's see questions. Yes, Tom.
You go back to your muscular atrophy diagram. So I feel like as instructors, we see this all the time, right? Is like, you know, I wonder how students are performing and maintaining those skill sets. I'm also curious to know if we look at this muscle euphemism as community engagement, right? And I'd love to hear your take on how, you know, that can either be bolstered or lost or atrophied, right? This idea of community engagement, community trust, and involvement and participation, because as we all know, it doesn't happen overnight, and it takes a lot to build those relationships as community leaders. So I just wondering if you have a note or a comment on this euphemism as it relates to community participation and engagement.
Well, I think that with everything, it's practice, 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 right? Like if we're going to go with this analogy, right? The more you practice, the better it gets, the stronger it gets, the more nimble, more agile, right? And so again, like the question is, does this technology help us practice? Or is it making things so easy that we even bypass the process and we can't practice this and we get worse and worse at it? I also teach computational modeling, you know, and it's always the same thing also, like they're trying to make black boxes. I'm like, that's not the point. The point is to make things that we can understand and be able to explain, because otherwise there is absolutely no point in this, you know, the tools that we're making, right? And so it's about that reasoning ability. It's not about bypassing thinking. On the contrary, it's to help us think. And we think really hard when we do that kind of modeling that way. And it's the same here. But I don't know, Theo and Sarah, you're in there too, if you want to jump in and also comment. Are they there? Maybe they're not there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think I heard the question. The question was, does the atrophying muscle relate to community engagement? Is that right?
Yes, Theo.
Oh, I hear a bad echo. Is it okay for me to talk, or should I just mute myself again?
You can talk.
You can talk. We cannot talk.
So in our approach to illustrating how incorporating a broader set of, or a broader understanding of planning ethics relates to how we should think about AI, this is exactly the scenario that we are using to think through it, where a planner is struggling to prepare for a community meeting that he knows is contentious, and is using AI to help him prepare for it by anticipating what different stakeholders might bring up in this session. And so what happens over the course of the scenario is the line between preparation for the event and helping him think through how to approach a community engagement event gets blurred to be more like substitution, where the AI chat GPT is prompting him back, oh, as a next step, would you like me to prepare a, hypothetical opening remarks? As a next step, would you like me to prepare phrases that you can use to diffuse conflict? As a next step, would you like me to prepare a hypothetical script that you can use? And then, and this is very exaggerated, but the last step in this process is, would you like me to prepare an example summary document of this hypothetical engagement that hasn't happened? And actually, it's quite rich. Like we've tried this. It produces a quite rich and quite detailed summary document based on all of the, case studies and practice stories that we as planners have written about for decades now. The problem is that what we care about is not only, the so-called process and the so-called outcome, but also the point of community engagement is to be out there in community and relate to each other and build that trust, right? And so what we'd like to consider by adding this third piece that is beyond the teleological and the deontological ethics is the value of relations. And there are other, of course, many planning paradigms that take this into account and center it, like therapeutic planning or emotional-based planning or indigenous planning. But it's really about understanding and proactively recognizing other ways of knowing and epistemologies that are not well captured by large language models.
Get it back to the original. Using the PowerPoint. Okay. This is the one, right?
And this the microphone here?
Yep.
All righty, let's see. I talk with my hands, so I'm gonna try very hard to hold this microphone and not just fly all over the place with it. Okay, hi, I'm Katie O'Connell. I'm here at the University of Minnesota. And this is, I'm really excited after this last presentation, thinking about the ethics, thinking about sort of humanizing generative AI in the classroom. And so I start with this sort of really broad question: how can planning education integrate large language models while preserving planning's core values and enhancing its unique disciplinary perspective? So first, thinking, what are these sort of core values? I wanted something pithy and short for our presentation, and I went to the ACSP website, and I thought this was perfect. Planners link knowledge with collective action, work in the public interest, and advocate for transformational change. Sort of sums up sort of our goals, what we're trying to do. And so then how do we get from that and then thinking about education? And so what is the goal of education? And I really, really, really love Paulo Freire, whose name I can't pronounce as well as I should, but he is Brazilian. He was this founder of critical pedagogy, and he really talks about how education is not neutral. It is not something that is, we're not just educating, there's a sort of a humanist aspect to it, where we're really trying to achieve a broader goal of equality, justice, and freedom. And he thinks of the classroom as a space where knowledge is collectively constructed. It's a back and forth between students and teacher as a sort of equal plane and not from teacher down to student. And so he says the goal is to make the student more human by developing this capacity to name the world, and by naming it, being able to transform it. And I thought that was really interesting, so our planning sort of ACSP core value is to advocate for transformational change. And then he talks about how our goal of education is to also have students create transformational change. So we've got these two sides, and so how do we get to the middle of them? So we begin with this sort of disciplinary perspective,
We have our PAB, required knowledges and skills of the planner here at the bottom. These are, as we think about, as we create classes, we're thinking about making sure we're touching on these and preparing our students to become practitioners who can sort of understand all of these parts. And then up from there, we start to think about the dimensions of learning. And this is the classic, the Bloom's taxonomy, which takes sort of working students from that bottom lower order of thinking and trying to get them to get up to that higher order of thinking to create a planning practitioner who has this ability to create and evaluate and move, sort of be better prepared for the world. But so that was the cognitive side of education. But thinking back to Ferrer, there's this sort of moral and political side of education. And so he has these two things called the banking method and problem posing. So down at that bottom is the banking method. That is, again, the educator who was going in and just telling students what they need to learn, just telling them, information. It's the old, I'm lecturing, you're listening, taking notes, I test you on it. And he says, that's very dehumanizing to students. That doesn't help them really understand the world better. And so he really focuses on, trying to get to this area of problem posing where, again, students and teachers work in collaboration to understand how the world works. So now we've kind of sort of thought about how we think about education. And so now how do we deal with this sort of large language models in the classroom? We've had a lot of really, really interesting examples that we've talked about today, but this is a lot of times for those classes where how do you deal with ChatGPT in an intro to planning class, where you want the students to be learning, but it's, how do you get them to respond with a way that they're actually kind of using the knowledge? So it's sort of a large language models really is almost a dehumanizing way of having, let me start that again, sorry. Large language models provide answers. And so that is kind of dehumanizing because it's positioning the student as just a passive recipient. So that's kind of the banking method. So if we think about how we create assignments so that it's not just give me this answer and the students do it, we actually think about how do we create assignments where students have to do critical analysis, sort of work back and forth with the tools, and that becomes sort of a problem posing model. So thinking about assignments, redesigning them. So, as I've been working on some of my classes, like how do I redesign these so that we're emphasizing these human skills that large language models aren't going to ever be able to do. And so the three that kind of popped in my head are critical reflection, collaboration, and community engagement skills. So I'm going to walk through a couple of assignments. And so this is for one class. This is Intro to City Planning, an undergraduate class, which is asynchronous. And I think thinking about an asynchronous class and dealing sort of with the ChatGPT answers is a really good way, because it's easier to do in a graduate class where you have 12 students to do something where you're doing interactive collaboration, but when you're completely online, it's more difficult. So that's why I use these examples. Alrighty, so the first thing is, so the assignment is over the course of the semester, the students all pick one city that they want to study. And then each week there's different sets of questions related to that week's theme. So this one's just a simple, what is the population of the city you're researching? So sort of in the traditional method, you'd ask that question, ask for some citations, and you're going to end up with this, the students will give you something, they probably went ChatGPT, got the answer, they just type it in. But in this sort of more humanizing method, we do something where I say, take a screenshot, go to the US Census, take a screenshot of the answer and respond with that. I don't need them to type anything, nothing, no other information. But what that's allowed them to do is to apply, to actually use a skill more than just typing in 498,715. So it's starting to move them up, sort of up to a higher level. So that's a, kind of an easy one. So here's a more challenging one. How did redlining impact your city? Okay. So in that one, the answers I've received in the past with the ChatGPT is this long, boring response that I know my student didn't write, but I don't want to accuse them of cheating, but it's obvious that it came from that. And by accusing them of cheating, you're also dehumanizing them as a student, as a person. So instead we say, again, how about you go to the Mapping Inequality website, take a screenshot, and that is your answer. I will tell you, it's so much easier to grade. It's yes or no, they did it. They got 100 or they got a 0. Love it. I love grading that way. But then you can take it up another level where then you can say, what did you find surprising about the data? Now you're getting their opinion, getting them to evaluate what they've seen. And that will help move them up even further into this almost the top level of that Bloom taxonomy where they're evaluating, they're thinking about their data, it's something surprising, something interesting to them. Another example is thinking about collaboration. So in a classroom, we do collaboration. We can also think about, as a lot of people talked about today, is collaborating with sort of the large language model. So here's one, find a community survey for your city and summarize the results. Got this little summary that I did, Washington Park neighborhood, it's blah, 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 pretty boring response. So instead I have the students do one where same thing, but this time I tell them use a large language model to summarize these results. And then do you agree with them? Why or why not? Include the data. And so here, the same first response, but now they're going in and they're saying, hey, you know, the summary said 83% of residents believe the stadium will have a negative impact on the community, while skepticism implies a mixed view. So the students having this opportunity to read through and question what the large language model is telling them, which is helping them sort of recognize that these aren't perfect. They're not exactly giving the right thing, and there's some bias and there's some questions. And then they're kind of pulling out their own knowledge to say, what am I learning from that? So again, sort of the first one, by basically them just finding the information, plotting it in, is really sort of remembering, is nothing, doesn't really move them up into higher level thinking, whereas this last one is getting them up to the level of evaluate. So last thing is community engagement skills. I underline skills because it is a skill that we as planners need to be practicing all the time. And that won't ever be replaced by large language models. There's things they can help us, you know, maybe synthesize information better. They can help us do certain aspects of it, but we will always have to talk to people. And that is hard. And so I think planning schools need to commit to supporting students at practicing their soft skills, doing as much of this as they can, because it is the basis of what we do, planning, engagement, communication, and leadership. That is something that is really important. There's a really good study that was just published in JAPER that talks about how to do more sort of reflective assignments in the classroom to help students better prepare for the emotional complexities of practice. Like going to community meetings, especially ones that can be contentious, is not something for the faint of heart. And if you haven't sort of thought through sort of the emotional aspects of it, it can be really, really difficult. So for my sort of concluding slide, sort of I think that as we think about creating assignments and you know, thinking about how ChatGPT and large language models can be in a classroom, they don't need to be banned, they don't need to be sort of looked as the only way to do class, but sort of look through sort of assignments through these things, think about our core values, think about our perspectives, the PAB accreditations, but really, really thinking about those dimensions of learning where we're thinking about cognitive, moral, and political methods to really help our students become more human is the way to do better education. And that's it. Good. Yes.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Did you offer an example of an assignment to acquire and practice the community engagement skills and understand the emotional implications of that?
So there is, so some, you were asking, so do I have an assignment of practicing that? I don't, but in that paper, that's up there by McSorley, she has, some really good reflection, that students do to help them. It's not so much community engagement. They're not doing community engagement, but they are sort of reflecting on who they want to be as a planner, how they want to be a planner, and having them sort of struggle through that through the whole semester to better sort of prepare them for the sort of the challenges that they're going to face going forward. I think does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for the comparison between the AI and the humanizing aspect. The AI is evolving. So eventually you can ask the AI to take screenshots. You can actually place the complete, humanizing process. So I would like to hear your thoughts on how we deal with this curriculum with this evolving change. I mean, change in the technology is changing. How do we really respond to that fast change?
That is challenge. That's the challenge, because it's so difficult to predict where it's going to be in 1 to 5 months, like so quickly. And students also sometimes are ahead of us in what they know how to do. And so, I mean, it can take screenshots, but I think doing that next step of what surprises you, and yes, a student can use ChatGPT to write what surprises them, but I find for the most part, they don't, because that's kind of their own opinion, especially if I highlight to them that there's no right or wrong. Like everybody in my class is going to get 100 if you turn your assignments in, because there's no right or wrong answer. And so by trusting them to do that takes so much pressure off that they're willing to respond. And so I think that's one way that I have found really works, because I've had a class where I didn't do that. I didn't ask those sort of what surprises you. And those are the things where I'm getting these just very boring responses. So yeah, does that kind of?
I have a comment kind of based off that real quick. It's just, I wonder if there's this innate human desire or cliff for using large language models where we talk about values, right? So you would reference humanizing these assignments, talking about students, what they value. So I have an assignment at the beginning of my courses where I ask students to do a video of themselves and their origin stories. Why are they in my class? What do they value? What are their interests? And I think there may be something there. So I'm going to check that paper out, but I've seen some elements related back to the human components of being a planner. Students, I think, lean into that and get away from hopping out.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good timing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay, next presentation is by Pamela
Robinson.
Robinson.
Okay, where are the slides?
Thank you.
I don't want to mess this up.
Yeah,
so-
okay. So, this one?
Yeah, that's me.
Move this up.
Holy smokes, folks, you're good sports for sticking in this late in the day. It's been a big and important day. I'm Pamela Robinson. I'm a professor at the School of Urban Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University, which used to be called Ryerson, for those of you who've been around a long time.
Closer.
Closer? Okay, great. My talk today is called From Code to Conduct, and it's work that I've been engaged with my colleague, Morgan Boyko. He's an almost finished PhD student that everyone should hire next year when he's on the market, but he's also a practicing planner. And we've been working with planners in practice for the last 18 months to try to think through what to do with this amazing thing that's called AI. So we all know that our work as professional planners is grounded in our codes of ethics and professional conduct. In Canada, we call it a code of practice. So I'm just going to call it the code so that it covers the whole, both of our countries. And these codes are fundamental to what we do, right? But they were written in a slower, more seemingly predictable time. They're static documents. The challenge of how to get the words off the page and into practice is a really big challenge for us. And the rise of AI technology brings a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity about what we do with the public interest. I think this is one of the most important conversations I'm having with students right now is what's the public interest when we use these kinds of tools? Our codes have adapted over time, both in response to community demand, but also in reflection from our profession, where we've recognized that we need to do more and we need to do better. And so they are evolving, but they really aren't keeping up with the pace of change that we're finding ourselves experiencing right now. So today's workshop is interesting because it points to all the ways in which AI may reshape planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we need to be differently among ourselves and in community and the work in which we do. And so in this presentation, I'm going to argue that our codes of ethics and professional conduct alone are important, but they're insignificant or insufficient at this time of change. We need to find new ways to ignite active, dynamic, and ethical thinking, and we need to find ways to reason together about how we work in the public interest in the digital age. What is going on here? That's weird. We have AI, but I can't change my slides. Which one did you use? The down arrow? Yeah, I tried that first before you came out. So we're all well aware of the limits and the challenges and the perils of AI, although interestingly enough, we didn't talk about them as much today as I thought we might have, but they're up here on the slide and I'm not going to take time going through them. I think the important thing for us as planners to think about is, like, it's one thing for society at large to acknowledge all of these, but what do they mean for us when we think about them through our obligations, through our codes of practice and conduct? What do we have to do as duty-bound professionals to uphold our ethics in the context of these kinds of changes in the work that we're doing? So I'm going to share 3 questions with you that'll help us think through this in a really practical way. The first one is, can planners ethically rely on AI tools when we lack a clear line of sight into how these systems are trained or whose data and values they represent? What's the public interest here? That's a good question, I think. Next question. Should planners be passive users of emerging technologies or active stewards of shaping how and when these tools are applied in the public interest? Next one. Researchers in marketing, psychology, and social science have been asking the question, should large language models replace human participants? We call this synthetic democracy in our research team. And as it becomes one step closer to being a reality in our practice, it moves beyond automated decision-making, and we have the opportunity soon to potentially augment or replace our residents in our planning processes by turning to these synthetic intermediaries. So with this near future potential of synthetic democracy, what does that mean for us in planning in our practice? There's lots of consensus building around the ways in which our profession might engage with these kinds of generative AI and large language model and machine learning tools. And some of the thought leadership comes from folks in the room. I think transparency and accountability and judgment get a lot more attention than the last 2 bullet points on this slide. AI localism is an emerging movement where people advocate for local decision makers, including planners, to take action to govern the use of artificial intelligence within their communities and to address the gaps that national or global policies have. The ways in which these things are imagined to be governed up high don't really land or resonate with real folks on the ground. And so it's really rooted in the belief that the people closest to the level of action are best suited to decide how these kinds of tools should be governed. The last bullet point on the slide is an emphasis on focusing on real democracy, that we really need to keep engaging with real people. That work is hard, and it's harder now for practicing planners than it's been in a very long time. There's safety training happening in Canada for clerks and treasurers, for example, around how to run public meetings in public, face-to-face, and how to stay safe. We have municipal councils migrating meetings online because they're not safe in person. So I don't want to dismiss the vital challenges of doing this work in person, but I would argue, and our research team would argue, that we still need to keep planning a very human practice. So our codes tell us what to value, but moving from norms and values on paper into active living, breathing codes of ethics and practice is really hard. The codes of practice aren't enough, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do next. So we have some guidance that comes, this isn't new or that new. In my experience with urban technology projects, there's a tendency a little bit to fetishize technology, to wave our hands and be like, oh, this is new and this is really hard and what are we going to do? But we need to remember and take a deep breath as planners that our whole job is to figure out what the introduction of new things mean for our people and our planet and our ecosystems and our governing processes and for our economy. That logic and that lens applies to digital infrastructure. It also applies to physical infrastructure where we have a long history of practice. So we can bring what we've learned from our physical planning expertise into planning for the digital realm. Heather Campbell's work from over 20 years ago on situated ethical judgment really focuses on our capacity to reason and act justly within real-world context and planning. So it's a really important context-sensitive and reflective opportunity to be accountable for our judgment. The adaptive governance literature, which mostly connects to climate change, but also speaks a little bit to digital governance, offers us new approaches that we might embrace as well. It has a focus on creating flexible and creative and iterative tools designed to help us manage complex systems. It's often advocating for decentralized decision-making and creating new opportunities for stakeholder engagement. So we can take what we know, we can revisit some of what we used to know, and start embracing other governance-related work to help inform what we do. So as we start to plan for cyber and physical infrastructures, we can think about new ways of dynamically thinking and doing. So what does animated ethics look like in practice? With Morgan, we've done a number of things over the last 16 months. We've developed an ethics guide for IAP2 in Canada. We've written a practitioner-focused article in Plan Canada, which is our planning-focused journal in Canada. We've hosted workshops with over 250 planners across the country to talk about ethics and AI. And we've created a tabletop exercise, which are these cards, which I'll talk about for a few minutes, that we call Planners AI Dilemmas. And we use these in a workshop, put a whole deck of cards on the table. I have an example here. The cards are here. We put them on the table, get out of the way, and let the planners loose. They work their way through the scenarios as they go, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of them here. The first one we call virtual publics. You're working on a high-profile public project with a tight deadline. A decision maker suggests that using AI-generated virtual publics to simulate community feedback in the planning and research processes to speed up the process and focus engagement. Do you agree to use this feedback? So a little bit similar to what Maura and Theo and Sarah talked about earlier. Next one, is this my job? At a public meeting, a local resident approaches you and shares concerns that their government-provided income supplement has been terminated and they think it's the result of automated decision-making. How do you respond and what will you do? Is this part of our scope of practice? Next one, public using AI, or we also call this the AstroTurf example. New supportive housing projects being proposed in public resistance is high. The volume of public input is much higher than expected, and there are notable similarities in the submissions. You're beginning to wonder if AI is intervening, and if it's generating fake submissions. If you were a municipal planner, what would you do? If you were a consultant on the project, what would you do? So these are everyday real life dilemmas that planners are facing, and we're trying to get them to think about it around the table. We've made the deck Creative Commons licensed. The deck of cards itself at the end on each table, there are a number that are open-ended, so folks can actually write their own scenarios, and we've been adding and adapting them as we go. One of the things that's really interesting about the process is that the things that we thought were a problem 16 months ago are like child's play compared to what we're dealing with now. And so there's this evolving sense of complexity and urgency, and it's really important. I'll tell you that this is, of the workshop that we do, you know, we like to think everything we do is important. The half an hour that planners spend around a table working through these scenarios, 100% is the most potent thing that happens in the room. And they report back to us because we're good planners. We do evaluations after the workshops. We get the same feedback over and over again. The chance to think together about things that are sticky and hard without judgment, with colleagues, and without any repercussions do we necessarily write is really valuable to people. And so why I wanted to come and share this is that this is one technique of others that we should start thinking about as a profession around how to expand our ethical capacity to do interesting and important work. So in this time of real change, the public interest, which is the driver of our practice, is no longer self-evident. As algorithms and data systems mediate participation and evidence and legitimacy and intervene in democracy, we have new challenges that we didn't imagine facing. If we want to safeguard the public interest, we need to cultivate the ethical imagination of our profession. In planning education, it's time to start thinking about how we teach ethics and reasoning along with literacy. In professional regulation, we need to update our codes to recognize more dynamic forms of practice and ethics. In governance, we need to build new participatory forums for AI oversight. And in practice, we need to continue to build our toolkit around how we together as a profession can keep ethics alive. Our progress from code to conduct is important. It gives us as planners the what, and now we have to figure out how to do the work as well. These cards are one tool. I'm interested in seeing if other people have developed other techniques. But if we can develop our habit of dynamic ethical reasoning, then our profession is going to move beyond adapting and reacting to technological change. We can return to offering place-based leadership focused on the public interest at a time when many questions arise and the answer about how to proceed is truly unclear. Thank you.
Perfect time management. Okay, we still have time for questions. One.
So I'd like to think I agree with everything you said.
It's okay if you don't.
But I actually do. Unfortunately, we seem to live in a world where we have an increasing number of autocrats at the head of many of our countries who, for their own reasons, are actively engendering a distrust of elites. And even though the people in this room don't think of themselves as elites, we think of ourselves as sort of the balancers. In the world of the Donald Trumps and the Nigel Farage, we are the elites who are not to be trusted. So how should we position ourselves to deal with this new world, which is not only one of changing technology, but in which we have people who are actively diminishing our good intentions?
So I'm going to take that like tremendous gulf of mistrust and also add that people already don't trust us because our profession has done harm in the past in communities. So I think that there's a real opportunity. This is where I have a little bit of hope in this landscape that, you know, our whole thing that we're supposed to be really good at is understanding how something new impacts real people in real places with real challenges. And I think we're talking in our planning school around how with our students, they need to be extra human, right? Not superhuman, but we need to be even more human than we used to be and make planning an even more human practice. We need the ones you talked about cultivating local knowledge, right? We need to be not the keepers, but the curators of local knowledge. We need to understand who are our people, what's happening in our communities. What is the machine missing and what is it not telling us, right? These are predictive machines based on averages and means. We're in the outlier business, right? And so I think, John, the way in which we start to move beyond being perceived as like aloof elites is that by being on the ground and on the sidewalk and in community with people, our community members start to see that we see them and we value them and we are bringing the things that matter to them into these processes from which they feel quite disconnected. That's my answer. Yeah, go ahead. Hi.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. So my question goes around, you see any disconnection between older folks who are not used to use technology and the defense technology that we see in AI? So how can we balance between community engagement with the gap of generations?
So the question for folks online was about how do we make sure that the rapid pace of technology change doesn't further exclude older adults from the process? I think this is, again, it's this question of like, who are our community and how do we work with them? And we have to remind ourselves that we've been working, you know, the conversation around planners and resident engagement for a long time has focused on a toolkit, not one solution. We need to continue to use toolkits. And these online tools or these AI tools may be more engaging for our younger residents and much more disengaging for older residents, right? And so I think it just forces us to have more stuff in our back pocket and to be better. The word uses acupuncture, like we need to figure out which thing do we need to use in which situations to have the conversations that need to happen. I can imagine over time that these kinds of tools, I mean, the interesting thing is like generative AI is embedded in all the platforms that municipalities are using. You used to have to turn it on and it's like all of our software, right? It's that you have to actively not use it rather than actively seek it. So I think we'll see some things getting easier. The idealistic version of that is we'll use the time we've saved in some settings to invest more in the harder things that the technology won't help us with. The fear, of course, is that at a time of government austerity and lack of trust in government, that people just be like, no, get the engagement done faster. You know, we're being blamed for the affordable housing crisis because planning takes too long and engagement is too clunky, right? And so we have this really important opportunity as a profession, I think, to remind everybody that good process matters for people, right? But that's a very, very steep hill to climb, but we have to keep at it, I think. Sorry, I went over.
Last but not least for this session is Tom Sanchez from Texas A&M. So I wanna. Okay. Do you have the? See, wait, hold on. Session 6. Hold on. Okay. Okay, thank you. Oh, the mic. Thank you. I'd like to thank John Wren and Wei for doing such a good job at organizing today. The panel has been terrific discussion today. I've really enjoyed it. So my question is, where are we going? Where do we go from here? And I would say I've had this paper about thinking about kind of North Star reviewed many times, and a lot of people really don't like the idea. And of trying to come up with an idea of about some kind of guiding sort of themes or plan to how we're gonna work with AI in relation, you know, to in working with our communities. And so, and I think the main thing, the one question is, or the main criticism is, well, we can't think that far out into the future. And there's too many unpredictable kind of moving parts. It's like, well, that sounds a lot like planning to me. And so it's not unlike kind of the exercises that we already, you know, go through. So why not think through it? And I think there was some of this going back to, I think it was the middle 80s or so, when the desktop PCs came out. Was that about right? Sorry, John, looking at you. But and so you know, there was some speculation about what that was going to mean. The computer's going to take people's jobs, and there was uncertainty about what it was, you know, how they were actually going to function in the office and how they would do planning. And we saw the same thing with some of the new software that came out, like spreadsheets in particular, and then GIS came along, and you know, and now we're on to this this new, I think, kind of revolutionary sort of era with tools, and I think it's very, very exciting. So what happened to me though was, and I expected this, I would hear all of the presentations, and then I would think to myself, I need to change my whole presentation now. Kind of in thinking through some of the comments that have been made about what AI means, how we're going to use it, when it's appropriate, things like bias and
misinformation and disinformation, which are exactly the same things that I hear from people I know, like family members, and bias from all sorts of information that I hear that don't come from computers, they come from humans. And so I think it's interesting, these big concerns that we have about, ethical behavior and bias. And, why all of a sudden is this, of interest now, when kind of we should have been thinking about it at, at this level of, with this much energy all along. But we are. And I was also thinking about too, is in a lot of the kind of the history kind of background on AI, it talks about the 1956 Dartmouth summer research project with AI, and I think it was Minsky and Claude Shannon, McCarthy, these guys. I thought, what would it be like to be in that room when there were none of these AI tools? There was none of this stuff going on. It was all kind of they were hoping for it. They were they were kind of trying to design it, trying to visualize or conceptualize what this stuff was going to look like. And we're actually in a place kind of, really early in terms of our discipline, but we're already working with a lot of these tools. So a different sort of exercise, but I think it's interesting for us to be thinking, and somebody mentioned it early on, how we are, this is kind of that one of those first steps. And I like that. Let's see. So I would have changed this figure, and thinking about the North Star really coming from kind of fragmented AI research, all this research going on in different areas without some kind of unified goal or objective or direction to work with. And I think about that in terms of the North Star as somewhat provocative. It's kind of like, well, should we do that? Can we do that? What would that look like? And I think that that's, something that I've heard, several comments kind of mentioning parts of that or reasons for that. So having to do with the ethics, trying to issues around sustainability, or I should say kind of larger sorts of objectives, fostering innovation, which I think is a very important aspect. I don't think I've heard us talking too much today about, well, what about, and really kind of thinking kind of further out, how can these tools really do something new for us that we haven't done before? And so really kind of being like the Mandelbrats or the Minskys, these thinkers that were really kind of, probably saying things that sounded a little bit wacky at the time, but then, here we have it. It's like, I think of H.G. Wells' idea about the world, what do you call it? The world brain. In the 1930s, this idea of the world brain will be able to capture all of the knowledge. And he was thinking about it in the form of, in like a written form, like World Book Encyclopedia. And so now we've even got something better. We actually are approaching a world brain when we think about, a large language model, and then when it starts to capture lots of other types of information besides just words, which were actually there. But anyhow, foster innovation, kind of innovative thinking, I think is very important for us. And the idea about a unified AI direction, I hope we discuss some more. And so this North Star idea, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this goes way back. Ancient navigators, were using the stars to know what direction they were going. Emerson's hitch your wagon to a star, kind of like do something new, go somewhere where somebody else, where nobody's gone before. Frederick Douglass with his idea, like working through emancipation. His newspaper was called the North Star. Confucius had some ideas around North Star as far as moral guidance and values. So this idea about North Star kind of direction, we see it kind of over time, in history, and I think we can draw on some of that philosophy. In the visionary frameworks, kind of having that direction. I think there are some interesting examples from that. The Sustainable Development Goals, there was some unity around that, working together, identifying, what these goals, what these objectives are going to be. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II, and and just kind of the atrocities coming out of that, and even something like the Human Genome Project, coming together and identifying that goal, and a lot of innovation and technology and effort needing to go into that. I was going to include the space race but I'm not sure. Maybe on a country by country basis, there was some unity in putting together the science to do that. But then it turned into something, it turned into something else. It turned into another kind of competition. So it may or may not, should be included. So my North Star framework, visionary thinking through, including equity, sustainability, accountability, all of these things, having been talked about today. And so how would this happen? So alignment with the academic mission. Why should we think long term? All we really need to do is publish papers and have them cited. That's our objective here. Developing some of these ideas over the long term. Well, that's not going to get me tenure. I need to show productivity. A lot of it this year. And so developing these ideas that take some time, I don't think that's a challenge for us. The funding incentives, even more of a challenge recently around some of these issues. Engaging the public has been talked about quite a bit here in terms of, I think, using these tools, and maybe not as much in developing the tools. There are concerns about trust in using something. We tell the public we're going to use artificial intelligence for these tools, and that might be very challenging. And part of the we're told, well, we need to be able to explain it to them. Well, I think one of the interesting things about that is that, when have we ever explained regression analysis to in a public meeting, or even a population projection method in particular? So, how much do we need to go into it in order for the public or the constituents or the stakeholders to understand what we're doing? What does that look like, and how would we accomplish that? The public engagement and the metrics for evaluation, a very important part of this as we implement, and this has also been talked about already as well. And so in thinking about what this North Star might look like, is it actually like the sustainable development goals, were, very identifiable, that we're going to be moving towards more of a touchstone, kind of, something that we look back on that gives us guidance, not a particular direction, but gives us some criteria in terms of kind of where we're going or what we're accomplishing. And then also another piece of that came up because of our concerns and the fear that we have about implementing AI and the uncertainty around that is something like Hippocratic Oath. Do we need to develop something like that that's just saying, do no harm? Or like Isaac Asimov's, what was it? The laws of robotic. You can't, a robot shouldn't harm a human. And a robot shouldn't be able to harm itself unless that it had some, unless it's protecting a human somehow. And what was the third one? Anyhow, about the robot in having the not being autonomous essentially, and that it's going to be taking it's going to be working for the good of all. And so having these ideas kind of melded or interwoven in with this kind of North Star concept of direction, I think is important. And so again, with some kind of thinking about this concept of direction here, what would that look like, and how can we, is it going to be possible to agree upon a set of kind of directions or objectives among researchers, which we like to have kind of our own identifiable product? Can we work together within the kind of the type of structures institutionally that we work with? And do we define what those principles are before technology defines us? So and with that, I'll stop.
Well, thank you, Tom. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so if there's no Q&A, we'll take 10-minute break. We'll come back. We'll talk about the journal applications. We have lots of good presentations on how to turn that into a journal publication.
One more reminder, we have a reception. This 30, yeah, and that's the local, we have a process. And we have some appetizers, but all the trees is going on, and not a lot of activity for
Start with capital, later everything else.
Thank you.
No,